Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to go and, well, here we are. We're starting weekly reads. Let's see if this actually works. So part of this whole thing was because I was doing monthly reads, sort of monthly wrap-ups, and they were getting a little bit out of hand. And that's not a kind of weird flex about how much I read, but that is more just because I never really stopped talking about most of these books, and so as a result they were just becoming quite unwieldy, and it sort of meant that some books kind of got lost in the fray, in the wash, whatever the phrase is. We're kind of just getting lost amongst all of that, and so I thought I'd sort of play around a little bit with weekly reads. Let's see how this goes. If these are a complete car crash, then we can shift back to monthly or some other permutation or whatever. But for the meantime, here's me kind of doing a bit of a weekly wrap up. And I wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And a couple of them are sort of new releases, sort of that I had as advanced copies. A couple of them are ones that I've been meaning to read for a while. And then the other two are sort of a bit kind of here and there. It's sort of a thing. Anyway, so let's start off. So there are two that I've got physically here with me. The first of which is The Pink Line, which is The World's Queer Frontiers by Mark Gevisser. And this is this looks a lot chunkier than it is. It's got kind of quite a lot of like a bit of bibliography and everything in the back. But essentially this is a book where Mark looks smart. Come on first name terms with him already. Mark Gevisser sort of explores what it's like being a queer person or an LGBTQ plus person across many different parts of the world. And I think what's quite clever about this book is it avoids what sometimes happens with books like this, where it kind of turns it into a, oh, those poor people over there, isn't it really hard? In a way that feels quite pitying and is quite uncomfortable. And I think what's really clever about this book is actually this book acknowledges it right from the beginning, and even enters into quite a clever discussion, I think, about what it's like to the often sort of Western sort of ideas of sort of sexuality are or gender are sort of seen as being like the holy grail that everyone's aiming for, and actually that it's very different in different cultures, but also how that whole discussion has led to some places, you know, purposely resisting LGBTQ plus rights because they're seen as a Western import. And so I think this book grapples with that quite cleverly, but also brings in quite a lot of very personal stories about various people in areas as sort of diverse as Israel and Palestine, as Kenya, South Africa, where Mark Gevisser is from, features quite prominently as well. And it really kind of explores various other parts of the world as well. So I was really quite impressed by this. I started reading it physically, and then also found that Scribe, Scribd. Scribe is a publisher. That Scribd had the audiobook for this as well, and this is quite a nice one to sort of let wash over me as well. So I really enjoyed this. The next one I had in person was Life as a Uniform. Life as a Unicorn by Amrou. Oh my gosh, what is happening with my words today? By Amrou Al-Kadhi. And you might know Amrou better for being Glamrou, their sort of drag persona. But Amrou has been really interesting on so many levels, because they have been a really prominent spokesperson on issues around gender and around particularly non-binary identities, and sort of how we view gender. And this book is such a beautiful version of going through their story, and particularly their life pre-Glamrou, you know, pre kind of identifying as non-binary and many other things, and particularly the sort of family struggles to sort of be accepted and to feel loved and kind of accepted by community. But this book, I think, is much cleverer than that and goes much deeper as well, in terms of looking at the various ways that things like shame and discrimination and not really having a sense of belonging, what all of those things can do to your psyche. And, you know, Amrou is really open in this book about problems with various sort of addictions or sort of substances, and how that shame has really held them back through various parts of their life. So really, really interesting. And I was really quite impressed by how this book does it. It's also very funny at times, but it is also incredibly dark in quite a few aspects, as is life, really. But I think this book is just really, really beautiful and really clever. And I can't believe it took me so long to finally get round to it, because it's a book that I've had on my shelf for a little while and have been meaning to read for even longer. So yeah, anyway, that's that. Next up, I read a couple of books that are for prizes, because I'm me. But the first of these I read was The Kids by Hannah Lowe. And this won the Costa Prize recently, the Costa Book Prize. And the Costa Prize is one that I sort of follow from a distance, in that I never really sort of sit and intentionally read all of the shortlist. And typically, because of the books I'll read throughout the year, and because of the timing of the Costa, because it sort of looks back on the year before, typically it means that most of the books in that list are books that I have been either meaning to read or have already read anyhow. But The Kids is one that I had not heard of at all. So it was sort of, I think, a bit of a surprise to some people in terms of it winning, just because it was a book, you know, it's poetry. It hadn't had quite the same sort of momentum perhaps behind it as some of the other books on the list, but I was still really intrigued to read this. And so this is a collection of poems, and particularly a sort of cycle of them. It's sort of, they're all kind of interconnected around Hannah Lowe's experiences of being a teacher. And it's sort of very much the kind of, you know, I taught some kids, they also taught me some stuff kind of vibe. Like it's very much that, but it touches on quite a few ideas around not only things like teacher burnout and sort of what it's like to actually be a teacher, and a few parts of that were very real as an ex-teacher, and also some other aspects just about, you know, young people's development and young people and their politics, and a few other things. And it's a really accessible collection. I think it's really quite easy to sort of read and kind of get involved in, and I thought there's some really clever poems in it. It didn't fully blow me away, but at the same time, I think these are really, you know, it's a really great selection of poems. I can see why it won. I think it's the kind of book that a lot of people will pick up and really enjoy. It didn't fully always work for me. I sort of sometimes wanted the poems to go in a little bit deeper. Some of them are quite short, but that is absolutely Hannah Lowe's decision and prerogative. And I still think there's a lot to enjoy about it. And I think particularly for people who, you know, may feel like they struggle with poetry normally, and sort of find that they can't normally find poems that feel like they're for them, I think this collection is probably one that you'd quite enjoy, just because I think it is really accessible. It's quite open. It isn't sort of constantly trying to sort of bamboozle you with all these like little linguistic bits sort of across the page. You know, you can sort of read the poems and sort of just live in the world of them as you're going through the book, and not have to sort of overthink everything. And that's actually a really nice, glorious thing to have in a read as well. So I see why it won the Costa. Next up, also for a prize, we have Scholastique Mukasonga with Our Lady of the Nile. And so this has been longlisted for the Republic of Consciousness Prize, which is a prize for indie presses and sort of small presses. And Our Lady of the Nile is a book that focuses a lot on schools in Rwanda, and particularly this sort of tension between the Our Lady, the sort of Notre Dame sort of figure that's sort of been brought in from France, and from particularly Belgian, sort of Belgian colonizers in many ways, to Rwanda. And Belgium and Rwanda have a history that I don't know fully enough about, and I don't really want to go fully into right now, but essentially, you know, Rwanda sort of suffered quite considerably at the hands of Belgian colonizers. And I think this book sort of basically looks at what that is like on a very micro scale, of if you're inside a school that is run by Belgians, or at least has a really strong Belgian influence, what that then means to a young Rwandan growing up and feeling that you don't fully belong, or feeling that you know, there's a sort of standard that you're trying to reach. Like, you should be speaking French because that's the language of success in the upper echelons of society. You should be conforming to certain beauty standards, or to certain standards of comportment, and, you know, all those sorts of other things. So really interesting in that regard. And it's interesting as well because the Republic of Consciousness Prize, from what I've seen so far, tends to really sort of push books that are really quite out there and a bit wild and experimental. And actually, compared to a few of the ones I've read so far, this is probably a bit more of a standard tale, and that's not to diminish it at all. It's more of a, you know, a really easily accessible narrative as well. But I think this book does some really clever things with how it frames a lot of that. I think this book, you know, would be quite right to you know, well within its rights to be an incredibly angry, polemic kind of book. But instead, it does it in a really clever, subtle way of introducing characters, having them sort of lampoon themselves almost, and it sort of is, yeah, quite compulsively readable, I think, and I'm intrigued to see the rest of the Republic of Consciousness long list. I'm planning to read all of them at some point, and sort of to see how this sort of sits alongside the rest of them, but still a really interesting book, I think. And last but not least, I read 2 advanced copies of books, which I realise now by the time this video goes out won't necessarily be that advanced still, as in I think the books are now out. But those 2 books I will do separate videos on because I really loved them so much, but I'll talk a little bit about them here as well. So the first was Julia Armfield's Our Wives Under the Sea, and I loved this. I thought this was gorgeous. This is so Julia Armfield sort of previously had published a set of short stories called Salt's Lowe, which I read recently and enjoyed, but I sometimes struggle with short stories. That said, despite struggling with the short story aspect of it, I was completely in love with how she writes. She's got such a rich, lyrical, sort of sumptuous and sort of generous writing style, but often with these very clever asides and sort of very clever observations. And Our Wives Under the Sea is that in novel form, and I loved it. Essentially, the story is a married couple, so 2 women, one of whom has been on a sort of deep sea sort of mission, I guess, in a submarine, and has come back seemingly traumatized and not really wanting to speak much about the experience. But in the meantime, you've kind of got that, you know, kind of army wife sort of thing, in the sense of somebody has been left at home waiting for their partner to return, and not knowing how long they're going to be away and if they're going to come back. And so a lot of the novel is sort of just, it basically switches between the 2 perspectives of these characters really trying to understand each other after such a long amount of time and after such a traumatic experience has happened to one of them. And Leah, the wife who is who has come back from this situation, finds herself just sort of constantly running up the water bill by sitting in a bath, and just sort of almost having this water experience of sort of, you know, needing to still be in there. And then her wife, who I believe is called Mari, I might be getting that entirely wrong, is sort of trying to understand what's going on, but also trying to deal with the fact that her wife is running up this water bill, but is also not really talking to her about any of this stuff. And she looks at sort of online forums, or fora, I guess the plural is, and it's sort of, there's a really funny moment where there's a forum where people talk about their imaginary husbands who are lost in space. And it's such a weird little aside, and the thing is, it actually really belongs to the story. It really makes sense in the story, but feels like such a funny aside because, you know, she's talking about these people in this forum who are sort of saying things like, oh, you know, he's sort of been out for years now, and I always wonder about what he's doing out in space. And it's so it's so random and silly, but kind of tragic at the same time. And I think that's what this book feels like. This book is always towing that line between utter tragedy and sort of weird, pointed, absurdist humour. And I loved it for that. And the book does this really clever thing, and I'm not spoiling the ending here, but the book at one point tells you, you know, many books or many media, I can't remember exactly how it's said, set you up and tell you know exactly how the story is going to end, and you know that it's coming, and then sort of basically makes a pointed sort of thing of saying, and that's probably going to be the case here. And it's so clever and so bold of an author to basically say, so you know how this book's going to end, right? It's going there. And it then follows through. And I won't spoil what that is, but I just think this is a gorgeous book, and I loved it so much. And I will be doing a separate video talking about it because I have a lot of thoughts, and I really enjoyed it. The other advanced copy I got was The Voids by Ryan O'Connor. And again, I think I will do something separate on this because I really enjoyed this book, and feel like there's a lot that I want to sort of talk about with it. But essentially, it is the sort of there's a sort of set of housing, sort of industrial sort of housing in Glasgow, I believe it is, that's sort of condemned. It's basically nobody should really be living there anymore. They're trying to clear out the last residents, and they're called the Voids. And it's sort of a bit of a hub in many ways for lots of people who are on the absolute margins of society. And those people, because of their marginalized sort of status within sort of society, are kind of also the furthest from really being able to get everything they need. And we meet our sort of main character, who is trying to deal with a difficult sort of family situation with various layers of trauma, with drugs and alcohol, with various other things, and he is really losing sense of the reality quite regularly. And it's sort of, there are little sort of echoes of something like Train Spotting, but I think this book is really interesting for how it approaches this, because I found the writing style just so convincing, and so interesting of this. There's a sort of almost very verbose character who's almost able to reflect on the situation outside, and the book sort of keeps going down its sort of little rabbit holes and little ideas. We learn more about this man's sort of family setup and how everything's happening, but his sense of reality is really sort of shifting, and as a result we can't always trust what's going on. And I was sort of hovering at between sort of 4 and 5 stars for a good amount of this book, and then the last 10 pages or so, it was so beautiful. It just sort of erupted in this sort of final sort of glimmer, and I was so blown away by how it did it. It felt like such a perfect way of ending this story, and not in a kind of big twisty kind of way, but just the way the book almost took all the themes and ideas of everything that's happened and recontextualized it. And it honestly felt like one of the best sort of final sprints in a book that I've seen in such a long time. It was so clever and so brilliant, and I really enjoyed it, as you may be able to tell. So I think I will do a separate video on that too as well, just because I feel like I have more to say than we'll probably squeeze into a weekly reads. But anyway, that has been me trying to squeeze my weekly reads into a decent amount of time, and I realise this is probably not a wild amount off half of a monthly wrap up, so well done, Bob. But I've been Bob the Booker. I hope you've enjoyed me rambling about these books. I'm also keen to hear how sort of weekly reads can be a little bit better, if there's other stuff that would make more sense in it all. But that's been me talking about those books that I read this week. What have you been reading? I'd like to hear a few more sort of recommendations if you have anything based on some of these books. And I've been Bob the Booker. Take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye bye.